thanks a lot for having me here. It is a great pleasure to be here and to talk here about some research that we have been doing. And I'm going to be talking about the bottom line benefit of apprenticeships. And I think the presentation can be broadly structured into 3 steps. So in the first step, I would like to present a very simple framework that I find very useful to think about costs and benefits in an apprenticeship. I will then talk about a simple accounting framework that allows to capture that empirically and then show you some results for different countries. But before I go there, I would like to start with a particularity of the apprenticeship market. So if we think about the market for schools, we have the government that funds the expenses, and then we have benefits on the side of the youth and also costs, and these costs and benefits drive the decision of the youth to enter a school program or not. We can also think about it in a more broad perspective, thinking about spillovers that this knowledge has on the wider society. In the apprenticeship market, there's an additional element. There are the firms, and the firms have to be willing to provide an apprenticeship place, and they have to be willing to make the investment into the training that the apprentices get. And so it's this decision here I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to talk about it from an economic perspective. There might be some firms that provide apprenticeship without benefit, but I think on average it's important to have employers benefit, to create apprenticeships in a way that creates a win-win situation, so that both the students and the firms can make a profit from entering this agreement. So in this slide, I am showing this very simple model, and the model on the horizontal axis has time. So there's a time before the program where the person receives the unskilled wage, which by assumption is the productivity. So as the program duration goes on, there is an increase in productivity of the apprentice, and in the end of the apprenticeship, he earns the post-training wage, which is again by assumption the productivity. So the difference between the post-training wage and the unskilled wage is the benefit of the individual. And here we see that this is a very important aspect of it. During the time period, we not only have the productivity, the productive value of the apprentice, we also have the training costs. And in this very simple model, it is assumed that there is a linear increase, for example, because wages increase. Just very simple. And what is clear here is that there is an investment period. There is a period in the time where productivity is low, but wages are probably higher. And then there's a return period. And in order to make a benefit for the firm, it is important that the return period is large enough or long enough to make up for the investment period. Now, these are the benefits and costs of an apprenticeship during the apprenticeship. And there are arguments that an apprenticeship can also be beneficial for the firm because post-apprenticeship benefits. And these usually come from a wage compression. So there are different theoretical models that explain that, but they kind of boil down to that the labor market is not perfect. And so the employer has some kind of power to pay a wage after the training that is lower than the productivity. Now, what is very important to note here is this is not freely adjustable. This is in particular, this is a function of how flexible the labor markets are. And so, in particular, in Scotland, where labor markets are relatively flexible in a global comparison, it's important to note that these post-apprenticeship benefits are likely going to be small, making it particularly important to design the apprenticeship in a way that the firms make a benefit during the apprenticeship. So I will be coming back to this to use this framework, but I will now go to a very simple accounting framework of net costs. And in this very simple framework, we have apprenticeship costs, and then we have benefits during the apprenticeship and benefits after the apprenticeship, and the difference between these two yields net costs. So if net costs are positive, we actually have a situation where it's not profitable for the firm, and we expect that relatively few firms actually provide apprenticeship places. If this is a negative value, then we expect firms to be ready to provide a lot of apprenticeship places. So what are the elements of apprenticeship costs? One thing is there are planning costs, there are costs that arise because of hiring and administration. Maybe the firm has their own classroom education, as you were talking about, so there are classroom education costs. But empirically, what turns out the most important thing is actually on-the-job training costs. So the person who trains the apprentice has to be there and explain the apprentice, they have to check their work, and this labor cost is a big part of apprenticeship costs. Now, the models, these accounting models, they use a very similar trick to value that opportunity cost. They just use the skill of the worker to value, to estimate these training costs. And what you see here are the results for Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. And what you see is that the skilled worker wage is similar in Austria and Germany, but about twice as high in Switzerland. So training an apprentice is actually very costly because the time in Switzerland that the trainer uses is very expensive. Now the fifth and actually also very important driver of apprenticeship costs are the labor costs. And here the apprenticeship wage, which is often determined politically, plays an important role. And again, when we look at the data for Austria, Switzerland, Germany, we see that the apprenticeship wage is actually similar in Austria and Switzerland, but lower in Germany. However, what is important to recognize is that the relative wage, so the apprenticeship wage in relation to the skilled worker wage, is about 36% in Austria and Germany. In Switzerland, it's only 18%. And that is going to matter because we're going to talk about that the apprentices do work which also skilled workers do. And so they do that at a wage which is very low, which really helps to make an apprenticeship profitable for the firm. And before I go on, I would just like to illustrate how I'm using this stylized model. So I was talking about the investment and the return period, and we can think about this as a decrease in the apprenticeship wage, that it reduces the investment period and the return period becomes much larger. So when the apprenticeship wage is decreased, and particularly if the relative wage is decreased, we see that the firms are much more interested in providing apprenticeship places. And that brings me to the second element of the accounting framework, which is the benefits during the apprenticeships. And there are two main drivers here. One, there is a possibility that there are subsidies, so that's one possible driver. But what it turns out in most cases, what really matters is the productive value. And when you think about productive value, there are a few key variables you can think about. And one is days in firm per year. So if the students spend a lot of time in school, they are not working, which means they are not creating productive value. And so the less time they spend in the school, the less productive value the firm gets. Another very important distinction here is how they are using the time. Some of it may be job shadowing, which doesn't produce anything. Some of it might be very simple tasks like getting coffee or making copies. I think every apprentice has to do some share of that. But then there is also, depending on how it is organized, it might be skill tasks. They might actually do what they were going to do once they're finished. And when we look at the data, we see that Switzerland, with 41% of the time being spent for skilled tasks, has a very high share there. So the Swiss companies, they use the apprentices to make very productive work. And as we have seen before, this work is actually very valuable because they are replacing someone who would be very expensive. And so when we look at this figure here, the way the companies organize the time of apprentices is absolutely key in determining the costs and benefits of apprentices. So I would like to spend a minute here to talk about the time issue. And here it's days in firms per year, and that's just an average. But when you think about this model, it becomes clear that a decrease in program duration has a big effect on the costs and benefits, because it has no effect on the investment period, while the return period is shrinking dramatically. And so duration is always a parameter of apprenticeships that needs to be considered. Another way to think about this framework is to think about the social status. And that goes back to my initial comment that an apprenticeship market is a balance between the incentives of firms and the incentives of of individuals. If the social status of an apprenticeship decreases, what happens is that the people who are being selected into the apprenticeship are getting worse, which means their productivity is worse, which in turn implies that the costs of the benefits of the employers go down and they are less ready to provide apprenticeship places. So it's always important to keep the interconnectedness of the market in the mind. I'm gonna go very quickly into the benefits after the apprenticeship. Here, saved hiring costs and saved adjustment costs are the key driver. But the key variable to keep track here is the share of retained apprentices. In Switzerland, only about a third of apprentices stay in the firm. In Austria and Germany, it's a large portion of apprentices that stay in the firm. And this is the key for the benefits after the apprenticeship duration. And here we see a very important difference between these countries, where Switzerland has very flexible labor markets, Austria and Germany does not. And so when we look at the net costs, we see that firms in Switzerland average make a profit. In Austria and Germany, they do not. And so they have to retain their apprentices afterwards in order to make up for the investment they make during the apprenticeship. So these are two very different motives of firms to make an investment. Down here, you see in black the distribution for Swiss firms, and in gray the one for German firms, which really shows that there is a large heterogeneity across firms, across net costs, across firms and occupations. But I think I have been talking a lot about these more theoretical things. I would like to show you some empirical results. And I would like to start with a study we have done in Singapore, where we have studied the Earn and Learn program. The Earn and Learn program is similar to an apprenticeship, but it has a duration of 1 to 1.5 years. It is very new. And I would like to highlight three things. First, as I said, the labor costs of participants makes a big share of the costs. Second, the on-the-job training costs, the costs for the trainer. This is a major driver of costs as well. In Singapore, subsidies actually make a large share of the benefits, and also the productive value is dominant, while the benefits after the apprenticeship are not so important. And so in total, we see that firms in this program actually have very high net costs, particularly because the duration is so short that the investment period is so long and the return period so short that it's very difficult for employers to make a profit. So unfortunately, as far as I know, there are no comparable studies for Scotland. So I'm going to do something very dangerous. I'm going to use England as a benchmark for Scotland. And I hope I'm going to survive that. So there is a study from Walter and Yoho. And what they do is they essentially use the survey information I've been discussing throughout the accounting framework, and they combine it with wage data from England. And together, this allows them to simulate net costs of apprenticeships in England, assuming that the training setup is the same as in Switzerland. And I'm going to show you some graphs for car mechanics. So here we see in blue, that's the gross costs, yellow, the productivity, I call that productive value, and then the net costs in red. For the first year of apprenticeship, second year of apprenticeship, third year apprenticeship, and the sum of these three. What we see here is in the first year, the gross costs are higher than the productivity. This is the investment period. So here we have positive net costs. This turns out neutral in the second year, and in the third year, the gross costs are actually lower than the productivity because they have learned so much. So on average, in the total app rather, there is a small negative net cost. So in terms of car mechanics, that's actually the setup of the apprenticeship is such that they can make a profit. When we look at the elements of training costs, we see something similar as before. We see that personal costs are the largest share of costs, apprentice labor costs are about a third, and other costs are about 20%. Now, one thing you can do with that is you can play around with the parameters of your system. So here in this, it's played around with the monthly apprenticeship wage on the horizontal axis. There are three models that differ in terms of apprenticeship duration and the share of formal training. Remember, formal training matters because it means apprentices are not in the company, which means they are not producing value. And we see that the lines cross the zero net cost line at different points. So for example, in the 3-year model with 2,200 hours, the zero line is crossed at about 200. Any wage above here produces net costs, which means that employers might not be willing to provide apprenticeship places here under these conditions. So this allows to think about how you can play with different elements and also think about whether you want to have some companies or some occupations to differ. So for example, in Switzerland, some occupations, they have increased the length from 3 to 4 years because they realized otherwise the companies don't make a profit, and so they won't provide apprenticeship places. So they increase the duration in order to ensure that there is a win-win situation. And so I think that is really the key point I want to bring home here, is that an apprenticeship market can be a win-win situation, and it has to be. And so it is important to keep in mind that the firms need to make a profit from the apprenticeship, either during or after the apprenticeship. And we see that the most important drivers of costs are the wages and the personnel costs, while on the other side there is the time use of apprentices as well as the flexibility of the labor market, which are key determinants of these different costs and benefits elements. And that brings me to the end of my talk, and I thank a lot for your attention.